Stofan, the Undersecretary for Science and Research at the Smithsonian. It's really great to be here with the U.S. Chamber here at the first Global Aerospace Summit, and of course being here in person is even better. You know, an important question facing all of us today is what happens in low Earth orbit, especially with human spaceflight, after the International Space Station retires. The ISS, as most of you know, was launched with a partnership with 5 space agencies representing over 30 governments. And it's been continuously occupied, which never fails to blow my mind, since 2002. But increasingly, it's serving as a destination for commercial companies who really are seeking to elevate, pun intended, science and research and technology in low Earth orbit. So today we're going to have a conversation, again, about what comes next. So I want to introduce our panel of experts. We have Misty Snopkowski, the Program Executive for Low Earth Orbit Development Program at NASA. Mary Lynne Dittmar, who is the Chief of Government and External Relations Officer at Axiom Space. Jeffrey Manber is President of International and Space Stations at Voyager Space. He also serves as the Chairman of the Board for NanoRacks. You know, for more than 2 decades, the International Space Station has made incredible contributions to the scientific community. Misty, with the largest orbital laboratory set to retire, how will NASA work with both its international and private partners in future scientific endeavors in LEO?
Does it work? Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you, Ellen. First, I want to say thank you, Ellen, for that introduction, and thank you for the conference coordinators for inviting me to come speak to you all today about this exciting topic of the vision of this new LEO economy and how NASA is trying to enable this vision to come to reality. And I just want to kind of take a step back and give some context about this vision that NASA has been working on, and it has been in work for over a decade now. If you look back at how NASA enabled commercial cargo and commercial crew, those 2 programs have been very successful. We've been able to develop new transportation systems here in the United States through both of those programs. And so now that we have that capability in place for transportation, the next step was to work on how do we enable commercial low Earth orbit destinations, or CLDs, as we like to use the acronym. And so that's the next step, to ensure that these CLDs are available when the ISS is planned to retire in 2030. And so our vision is to have these CLDs in LEO ready by 2030. They would be owned and operated by private industry, and NASA would be one of many customers for these commercial LEO destinations. So how do you make that vision a reality, right? Like, what's the strategy that NASA is trying to put in place to make that happen? And what we've done is organized our strategy into 2 parts. You can think about this LEO economy as a supply and a demand. And so on the supply side of the LEO economy, what we're trying to do, when I talk about supply, I'm talking about the transportation and the destination. So when you're talking about free flyers, the commercial element on the International Space Station, all these platforms that are going to be in low Earth orbit, that's what we consider the supply side of this LEO economy. And so what we've been doing in like the last year or so within the commercial LEO development program is trying to get these commercial destinations up and running and get the design and the development started. We have 4 partners in our portfolio right now for commercial LEO destinations. We have Axiom Space, that you'll hear about more later in the conversation. We have them on contract to develop a commercial element that will attach to the front of the International Space Station. And then we also recently awarded 3 funded Space Act agreements with industry through Blue Origin, NanoRacks, who you'll hear about more later, and Northrop Grumman. And so that is our portfolio to start the development of these commercial LEO destinations. You know, it's 2022, already in September. We're targeting ISS to be retired in the 2030 timeframe. So it sounds like a long time from now, but it's really not when you're trying to develop new space vehicles. And so that was really our biggest priority on the supply side of the economy, is to get this CLD design and early maturation up and running. And so, and I'm happy to say that we've been making a lot of progress so far this year on all 4 of those designs with our partners. And so that's kind of what's happening on the supply side and how we're interfacing with industry. The other side of the strategy is what we call demand. You know, what are people going to want to do once they get into low Earth orbit? What are the things and the activities and the science and technology demonstrations and the research? What are the other things that customers and future astronauts are going to want to do in LEO on these CLDs? And so one of the things that we're also working on within the program are enabling private astronaut missions to the International Space Station. And I'm sure everybody in the audience knows this. We had our first successful private astronaut mission just this past April with Axiom Space. They completed their AX-1 mission. We've got a lot of lessons learned that we've gathered from that first PAM, is what we like to call them, private astronaut missions. And then we recently announced at NASA that the second private astronaut mission will also be through Axiom Space, and they're calling that AX-2. And we're targeting to do that mission in the second quarter of 2023, next year. And then also, just this morning, we at NASA announced a new solicitation for private astronauts 3 and 4. So that's been released to the public, and we'll be holding actually a pre-proposal conference on Friday to talk a little bit about the details for private astronaut missions 3 and 4, and then those proposals will be due in late October. So that's a lot of work that's been going on the demand side of this LEO economy vision that we're trying to enable. And then just kind of touching on the part of your question for international partners, that is a big effort that is in work right now at NASA. We definitely want to make sure that we maintain our relationships with our IPs, our international partners, going forward. Once the ISS retires in 2030, we still want to make sure that we have those partnerships in place. How exactly that model is going to work and what it's going to look like, we are still working on that. It's a work in progress, but we want to make sure that not only do we maintain our diplomatic relations with our international partners, but we want to have a model in place that also allows for our commercial LEO destination partners to be able to capture that part of the market, that international part of the market, so that their business case can close. So there's a lot of factors that come into play when you start talking about international partners in the international market, and so that's a lot of work that's still ahead of us, but that dialogue has been started at the agency.
That's great, thanks. And now I'm wondering, for companies like NanoRacks and Axiom Space, when you're thinking about the next generation of platforms in LEO, how are you thinking about it in terms of capabilities that we already have in LEO that you would like to see continue versus capabilities that we don't yet have that would be really valuable, especially for commercial customers? And so I'm thinking about things like purpose-built types of platforms where research or technology could be developed. So I'm wondering how both of your companies are thinking about that. And Jeff, I'll start with you.
Thank you. I'm struck by the time we spent on looking at the hardware. For me, and when I've always looked at low Earth orbit, it's not the hardware, and people in the agency always go crazy when I say that. It's what is the business model? And so to really answer your question, you know, what is the business model? What is the market? And I think we're still learning. It's easy for us to say, oh, it's in-space manufacturing and it's this and that. But truly, what is the business model? And so at Voyager Nanoracks, we're focused on the George Washington Carver Science Park. We're having a kickoff with universities. It'll be announced in the next few weeks. And of course, the hardware is important, what platforms, et cetera. But it's also how do we make sure there's a sustainable payload, sustainable pipeline outside of the astronaut program? The astronaut programs are so important domestically and internationally, but can we finally reach that point we've all dreamt about in LEO, where we make the breakthroughs? And that's what we're trying to wrestle with. And I'll turn it over to you with that.
So I was just earlier today at the Biological and Physical Sciences Steering Committee for the Decadal. As many of you in the room may be aware, the BPS Decadal is underway, and the Decadals, for those who don't follow the Decadals, is a convening of some of the best scientists actually in the world, certainly this country, who then come together and establish priorities for the next 10 years for domains of science. And the question of sort of what is that customer base, and we had some conversation about scientists as customers, but also their institutions as customers, and how does that work in funding in an environment where you have companies there that are operating commercially. And so Jeff's point here about, what is that pipeline? If we understand what the demand is of the science community, the research community, and then in-space manufacturers, people who want to do commercial R&D and whatever, I have no doubt whatsoever that all of the providers can provide those capabilities. So, for example, the ones that we already know about, right? Furnaces, freezers, glove boxes, all the rest of that sort of will continue to be established. External payloads, right? We already know, we've learned some things, especially on the science side, from the ISS, but there are a lot of applications for Earth observation, for national security, et cetera, having to do with external payloads as well as internal payloads. And then one of the ones that comes up quite often, of course, is the ability to now do edge computing, where you place computing literally right at the site, where you don't have to worry so much about downloading all of the data and then doing the computation down on Earth. But then that leads you to, okay, then what do we need in terms of advanced communications capabilities, optical, RF, et cetera? And then that leads you to, how do we manage cybersecurity? So there's certainly a chain there that I think everyone who thinks about this is aware of, and I think all of these companies are concerned with that. But I agree, the issue really is, what is that market? How do we establish those pipelines? How do we bring people on board? How do we continue to educate people about what is available to them in this thing I'll call low Earth orbit? It's not just microgravity, but the other sort of physical characteristics that are unique there. And so, so I think that's what we're all kind of trying to think about.
The industry seems to be reaching an inflection point. It's to some extent why we're here, right? Because there's a significant amount of private investment, private capital that's been entering this market. And that has made, space seems to be more attractive to investors. Why do you think that is? Is it because people sense there is actually a significant customer base out there? Is there, and you're going to get mad, is there a profit motive that people are seeing and that's bringing investors in?
I'll go first.
Please.
Yeah, I'll go
We're
first.
going to let
I defer, absolutely.
Okay. It ticks me off when people raise the profit motive, because it's the only industry where they raise the profit motive. I just watched the finals of the U.S. Open on TV, of the U.S. Open, and nobody said, hey, are they playing because of the profit motive? So it ticks me off.
It's a big purse at the end of the
Yeah, it's a big purse, okay? But I will say, and I know we're cognizant we have a short amount of time, I do have a worry, it's slightly changed. It's very unusual. On the panel are two of the leading new space companies, neither of which SPAC'd. Okay, so we have not to use that awful phrase, de-SPAC'd. It's like deplaning. We have not de-SPAC'd. Okay, and what worries me is over $1 billion were raised, were invested by investors into new space. And you look at the price points now, everyone's down 50–60%. Right. Have we lost a generation of investors? Right. I actually worry about this. Okay, how do we get back all those people who are down now in this new asset class? So I think the investors, and then I'll turn it over to you, Mary Lynne, but I think the answer, the short answer, the non-sarcastic answer, is that the government behaving as a customer has opened up the marketplace for investors who are not space nuts. And so as long as the government remains a customer, no different than in acquisition of tanks or planes or other things, then you can get legitimate investors.
I agree with that, and I also think that because the U.S. is leading in this way, is acting like a customer, other nations are also paying attention. So, for example, Jeff's title is International in Space Stations, right? On the side of, on Axiom, we've signed recent agreements with New Zealand, for example. They're not flying a private astronaut with us. Their focus is on research and development. We've signed agreements with Hungary. We're going to make some other announcements, which I'd love to give you now, but can't at IAC next week. And so what's happening is that other governments are also watching the U.S. government act as a customer and think, well, wow, we can do that too. And by doing that, we can start to bootstrap into our own culture the benefits of flying into low Earth orbit, both in terms of advancing our own research and technology and science portfolios, but also enhancing our own capabilities and learning as we go. And I think all that's happened because the U.S. decided to act like a customer.
And Misty, you're clearly thinking at NASA on how do we become a customer as we go forward?
Yeah, I mean, our messaging is very much NASA's one of many customers. So that's definitely part of our strategy. And I will say that when we recently awarded our funded Space Act agreements and we had all of our kickoff meetings, and we've also said this message to Axiom, you know, we want you to develop these commercial LEO destinations, but even more so, we want you guys to help make this vision of a LEO economy a reality, right? So like how Jeff was saying earlier, you can, you know, we love talking about hardware because we're all engineers, but we also are trying to make this new economy. And so kind of echoing what Jeff said, or that NASA is just going to be one of many customers.
Now I know it, and I know this has already been discussed, you know, because it comes up again and again and again. It's something everybody's concerned about, workforce. And obviously one of the things that is on, you know, top of everybody's mind is to how do we really open space to a more diverse and inclusive workforce with a broader range of participants. And I'm curious, as you look forward to this, you know, vision of low Earth orbit with commercial platforms, how are you thinking about how do we engage the next generation in being inspired to come work in what we all see as this incredibly positive, you know, market and world going forward? Mary Lynne?
Well, I think part of it is just achievement. As things become more and more visible, as it becomes clearer that there's a broad range of interest, and we're not just talking about low Earth orbit here, but beyond that in space, I think then that sort of naturally draws people in. But the other piece of it, I think I've heard Charlie say earlier today, the majority of people working at NASA are not engineers, right? And I think that there's a lot of discussion now about the fact that, you know, business people who are interested in developing markets and in growth, goes back to the investor question also, see the opportunity to come in. And then for us, it's, and I'm sure in Interact also and others, it's not the space companies, right? It's the other companies. It's the other companies who are starting to think about, gee, what can I do with space? What can I do in space? And then you start to bring in a lot of different interests. Same for education. There's a lot of different pathways now to participate in space that are not necessarily engineering, and they're not even necessarily science, but technology development. I'm teaching, I was mentioning earlier today, I'm co-teaching a class at Purdue University right now where I'm a space policy fellow. And I get the biggest kick out of talking to these students who are now talking to their younger siblings who are in high school, okay, or even younger, about putting together their own CubeSats and figuring out how it is that those high schools can partner with universities or with community colleges to basically get CubeSats up, all right? That was all made available just really, I mean, the change in the last decade is stunning. If you think about where we were 10 years ago and where it is that we are now, and the things that are sort of available. People are looking at fashion design. I know that sounds funny, but you know, they're thinking, how can we design? We had a designer come in and design our crew cabin, an Axiom. So all these different opportunities that are now becoming more and more available to people to think, hey, wait a minute, I could go do that. I don't have to be an engineer or a technologist to be able to do that. And so I think a lot of outreach.
I think very quickly I'll add on you know, the space community more and more reflects the American society, good and bad. And so we have to push to make sure there's diversity.
Yep.
You know, we created Dream Up, an educational company in Nanarax, very proud of it. Works with students, works with historically black colleges and universities. It's not easy. You go into the historically black colleges and universities and they're like, hey, space ain't me, you know? Yeah, I mean, it's not, I don't see myself there, you know? And you gotta just work. It's an uphill climb, but you have to do it because it's the right thing to do and it's good karma. So.
Misty, how are you thinking about this at NASA?
So at NASA, just recently, they added a new core value of inclusion to the list of core values. And so I think that was a signal to the entire agency and to leadership that, you know, when you're talking about diversity, you need to talk about it from a perspective of inclusion. And when that message comes from the top, you know, that's where it starts. And so it permeates into the rest of the agency. And we've also just recently, Administrator Nelson just recently put out a new policy on our diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility policy. And so those are a couple things that have been in work at NASA. And there's also been a new focus on the employee resource groups so that these different communities within NASA can feel that they are being represented and heard, you know, at the leadership level. I will say, just from like a personal perspective, a couple weeks ago, I had lunch with a couple women, young ladies that were in the Air Force, and they were fangirling on me, which I kind of like laughed about, but they just wanted to know everything about like what I was doing, what was happening in, you know, this LEO economy that we're trying to enable, and they were just fascinated by it. And I think that this is a moment right now where it's a renaissance, and it's a very exciting time to be working in space, and I think it resonates with a lot of young people.
And I will say, I'll put in a plug for the Air and Space Museum here, and I hope all of you know the half of the building is going to open in mid-October, reopen, and you'll see the beginnings of the whole renovated Air and Space Museum. And I think as you go through the museum, you're going to notice that there are a lot more diverse stories being told, and we're really thinking about this, and I urge people, I think it's available for another day or so, the designs for the new Bezos Learning Center, which will be built attached to the Air and Space Museum, where we're really going to focus on this issue of how do we inspire the next generation of builders and dreamers. Question, in what way is the Chinese Tiangong station and the planned Russian space station competing with U.S. and allied interests? And what are the implications of this competition? What are the opportunities? And how can we address them? And how do you look at that from, you know, both the NASA point of view and or if NASA doesn't want to address this, and from a corporate point of view? Jeff, I'll throw that to you first.
First off, let me say that you know, it's on so many levels. The Russian war is so disappointing. So many of us, you may know, I worked very hard to bring Russia into the family of nations and involve and bringing them into the ISS. And so on all levels, it's you know, it's tragic what's happening now. But let me say quickly, I know we don't have that much time. I dislike playing the political card, but it must be played. And so the Chinese are making a strong effort in low Earth orbit. They have a station. The hardware on the station is top-notch. I have a list of all the scientific research they have on it. It's fantastic. At Nanarax, I don't know if I can say we anymore, but Nanarax lost a customer to the Chinese. Okay, so from a political point of view, it's real. From a commercial point of view, it's competition. How much it will be commercial doesn't really matter. So we're entering this new period where we have the Chinese, they're there. We have, maybe there'll be a Russian station. There'll certainly be a station out of India. There'll be multiple US stations. So it's just that time when there'll be a combination of political, national destinations, and there'll be commercial. So it's a very complex puzzle.
Is that good? Is it an opportunity?
Yes and no.
It just is.
You know, it is what it is. I think I'm a fan of both competition and collaboration, and so I think both of them are really important. I think they're woven into American society and economics and culture, and so, you know, I'm a fan. If you go back to talking about the Chinese, though, I'm kind of known, I wouldn't say that I'm a hawk, but I am certainly someone who's concerned about the competitive aspect of that. I testified before Congress last October, and I went through an entire litany of the investment that Chinese are making in so-called commercial space. And I call it so-called because, of course, it's heavily government funded. At the point that I stopped looking at it, which was 2020, there was $58 billion sitting in a fund in China that's basically funding commercial space efforts, everything from launch and propulsion systems to commercial space stations. And if we're not paying attention to that and to the fact that they are very clear about the fact that their new Silk Road runs through space, then we're fools. Just to put it. So yes, I think this is something that we need to be very concerned about, and we need to be thinking about it when we formulate policy with regard to how it is that we're going to ensure that we continue to have American leadership and leadership among the partnership that's been involved with the ISS going into the future. Yeah, I think this is a great concern.
Misty, I assume, you know, NASA's focused on maintaining U.S. leadership in LEO and beyond.
Yes, yes. So, I mean, you know, the competition is not, we don't see that as a bad thing. And, you know, we acknowledge their achievements, and, you know, it's an exciting time.
Very exciting.
If I can just quickly add, at NanoRac's 13 years old now, we faced governments before with a competition, space agencies that do things for free. Right. And so this is not new for the commercial sector. It takes a different slant because it's China and we don't see eye to eye in a lot with China. But I'll just say the commercial space community has faced national competition from sovereign nations before. So
including this one.
Yeah.
So we've got about 3 minutes left, and we are fully aware we're standing between you and the reception. So I want to give everybody just a quick, you know, how are you feeling when you think about the opportunities in low Earth orbit over the next 10 to 15 years? Just 2 sentences, and I'm going to start with Misty.
Oh, how am I feeling? I'm inspired. I think it's a really exciting time. You know, my background, I got to work on the commercial crew program from the very beginning up until our first demonstration launch with SpaceX. And so now I'm getting another opportunity to get a new program off the ground. And so for me, it's a really fulfilling career path and a super exciting time to be working on this new LEO economy.
Awesome. Jeff?
When I started, the United States was single point dependent to get to and from space on the space shuttle, and you would vehemently and passionately argue with very good people that commercial can contribute and commercial services was essential. And I look now at the war in Russia and see the contributions commercial space companies are making in Earth observation and decentralized internet, which we never would have expected. And so it is so satisfying for me personally to see us go from what I always kind of call I'll say a socialized program into one that reflects the, no offense, Charlie, you know, but that reflects the, you know, the more of the way we do markets. And so I never thought we'd reach this point, so I'm thrilled.
Mary Lynne, you get the last word.
I want to acknowledge both NASA's role as a partner in this endeavor, but
I should have
also.
done that. I should have done that.
Okay, I'll do it for both of us. But then I'll kind of knock Jeff's socks off here. I said I also want to acknowledge Jeff's role. He's been a huge pioneer, a huge mover and shaker of this. He was advocating for this years before anybody else saw the vision, and so I just want to thank you. And also, I do think that there's tremendous opportunity in low Earth orbit. Actually, I just think it's our imaginations that are holding us back at this point, and great opportunity for growth and a welcome investors. Yeah, welcome.
Well, thank you very much, and I hope this has been a great end to your day, and thank you for attending the Global Aerospace Summit.
Good stuff.